Good morning. People always ask me what's very different about, what was the first thing that struck you about America when you first came here? And it's exactly what Shirin mentioned. I went to college about a month after arriving in America in 1985 in September, and I entered my classroom and I started saying, "Good morning, good morning." And people looked at me like I was crazy, and it took me a long time to realize that people don't greet each other, and I still, to this day. So when she emphasized saying, say hello, I knew exactly where she's coming from. So, which is a roundabout way of saying thank you so much for having me. It's wonderful to be here. If you can ever get yourself over to Professor Mafi's house for a meal, don't miss the opportunity. I've been treated so well already. And I was also treated by Malcolm, who's here, another wonderful host, to seeing the public art piece last night, which I thought was marvelous. So I will stop at the end of my presentation in case some of you would like to ask questions, or in case we should have a conversation about it. I assume that some of you have been forced to come to this presentation today because it's extra credit or whatever, but don't worry, I tend to be somewhat entertaining. It will be worth your while. You won't suffer very much. In this morning program, I was asked to talk a little bit about my memoir, Journey from the Land of No. And I always have to start that conversation by saying that first of all, it's really not exactly what you think or a memoir ought to be. In other words, I always think that one has to be extremely careful about one's own self-indulgences. So when I was told to write a memoir, I knew better than to assume that my entire life is worth writing about. So perhaps I did something that has proven to be somewhat smart, which was to really choose a focus of only a portion of my life that I thought could be worth your time. So in other words, even though the book is called or calls itself a memoir, it doesn't begin, fortunately for you, with the first day of my life, nor does it end, with a couple of years ago or anything. Not all of my life has been that interesting, and certainly not all of it has been worth the attention of public readers. Rather, I chose 10 years, a very focused slice of time from my life, because I thought that those 10 years are in fact of value to wide readers, especially in the United States, because those were precisely the 10 years during which Iran as I knew it transformed. And we are sitting here today, as we do oftentimes here in this wonderful country where we're far away from the troubles of the world, and that's one of our advantages. But perhaps it's also one of our disadvantages, because we are far away from the rest of the world, which in a roundabout way, what the wonderful piece of public art does. It brings the rest of the world that's so far away right in the middle of this big bustling city. And so in writing this memoir, I thought those 10 years that seemed to have only to do with my life, with the life of my country, Iran, shouldn't be considered 10 years that belong over there. In fact, those are the 10 years that changed all of us in the Middle East, and then the relationship between the Middle East and the United States. And I think as a result of what happened in Iran in 1979, the world and the politics of the world have forever changed. And it is that argument that I'm bringing you today, just like your piece of public art. I'm here to argue that Iran seems like a distant place, but it isn't. It seems like a place where the United States has nothing to do with, but it really does. And that it still affects us. Even some of the most distant events of Iran, as distant as 1979, they still affect us in this country, whether we are Iranians, Iranian Americans, or just Americans. And so without further ado, let me take you to my memoir and to those 10 years. And the memoir really begins in 1974 when I am about 8 years old, living in Tehran. Now, I was on NPR this morning having a conversation with one of the show hosts, and I was asked what Tehran was like back then, Tehran of my memory, and the way I described it was we were experiencing a golden era, or as golden as it could be under the circumstances of religious, ethnic harmony in Iran. So my family, being a Jewish family, lived on an alley alongside so many other religious minorities, Christian Armenians, Baha'is, some of whom may have never heard, but there is a religion which is sort of an offshoot of Islam, and they're called Baha'i. Zoroastrians, who were the original, Zoroastrianism was the original religion of Iran. And all of us were living side by side in this middle-class neighborhood in Tehran around 1974. And you know, I'm sure I was too young to recognize some of the tensions, but we can all agree that it was quite peaceful. And my father ran one of the Hebrew schools that existed in Iran at the time. And he is also a poet. Was then, continues to be, as much as his poor eyesight now allows him. And so with this little passage, I'd like to take you to that neighborhood in 1974 and give you a snapshot of what it was like back then. Being one of Father's own was an honor and a burden. People saw us as his ambassadors and expected us to show just the right blend of faith, intellect, and mastery of rhetoric, and the ability to rhyme on demand. Each compliment showered on us, in reality, was an expectation indirectly declared. As the youngest Hakakian and the only girl, I inspired little hope and drew prayers to reverse my precociousness. My brother Bez, who was 5 years my senior, and born in the same year as the Crown Prince. I'm sorry, for those of you who are very young, I failed to mention that the political transformation that took place in Iran was a transformation from monarchy to a so-called republic. So the government that's in power at the time of this piece is a monarchy, the last monarchy that ruled over Iran, and the dynasty was called the Pahlavis. And so when I refer to the Crown Prince, it's the Crown Prince, son of the Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, who was the king of Iran at the time. My brother Bez, who was 5 years my senior and born in the same year as the Crown Prince, was believed to be the brightest, most erudite and congenial among his classmates. The only fair-haired child in a family of brunettes, we believed him to be better looking than others his age, even his royal counterpart. My brother Jabid was exceptionally handsome, but no one dared say that to his face, for he, a fierce debater, would surely find it a most superficial statement. At only 17, he was among the few young men who headed the Jewish Iranian Student Organization. 2 weeks after a telephone line, that easy to remember 891444 was finally installed in our house, We all came to the conclusion that it was Javid's private line we had just installed. Invite Hemingway to the Hakakians for a day, my brother Bez used to say, and he would never again wonder for whom the bell tolls. Sometimes father expressed his irritation in the reminder that a telephone was to be used only in emergencies. Otherwise, why would Alexander Graham Bell bother to call his assistant to say, "Watson, come here, I want you," and hang up? One line is all that should be exchanged on the telephone. "Hi, we're healthy, goodbye." But even our household of stars had only one genius. Only one shouldered the burden of being the firstborn son, fulfilled everyone's highest expectations, and then went on to impress those tough to please. Only one child had the approval of Queen Farah, her signed letter congratulating him on winning first place in the national drawing contest. Only one of us made the record for being the youngest cartoonist at 19 on Iran's editorial board of leading satire magazine, the first to put the Hakakian name in bold-face print, Albert. Albert's exuberance alone populated our house, his sketches strewn about, pens, books, brushes, and easels aside. In his spare time, when he wasn't finishing the commissioned piece or studying to skip a grade, he breathed life into whatever he touched. After he painted our outhouse in Art Deco style and added a Mad magazine rack on the back wall, pissing became the family's most favorite outdoor activity. If any of us wanted to take a picture, we asked our subject to say cheese, but not Albert. He had us name a slew of dairy products until we struck what he considered a truly original pose. I understood Albert best by watching him. The callus on the side of his right middle finger, the ink stains on his delicate hands, his tender features, square jaw, and shiny, straight hair amounted to a seraphic presence despite his beat-up overalls. Even a grocery list in his handwriting looked like a piece of calligraphy and was hard to throw away. And the photograph on his university ID, which looked no less radiant next to the gold royal seal, said, "Name, Albert Hakakian. Place of birth, Tehran, Iran. ID number 264. Year, freshman. Campus, the Academy for Visual Arts. Year of attendance, 1974. That was 1 year before he left for America, before he flew right out one day and left our family portrait, a grin with a missing tooth. So that was the first piece I wanted to read you, and I wanted to read the story of my brother's departure because it is the moment when I began to know that things as I knew it fell apart. It is the moment when our family was never whole again. He left to America, and one of the examples I always offer is that, for instance, we were never the same, and you know, some people ask me, how were you not the same? Well, my mother wouldn't cook the dishes that he loved to eat, and now that he wasn't at home, she would refuse to cook things that we all loved because he wasn't there to enjoy it. And there was this sense of melancholy that came into our life, and his absence was deeply felt. And even though I was very, very young, I wanted to know why he had to go to America. And that launched me, and for those of you who are familiar with the memoir, you'll see onto a quest to find the answer to this mystery, which was revealed to me later on through various friends and books, and told me that the reason was really that my brother had entered college in Iran. He was an artist, and he was a very thoughtful, like a lot of other artists, a very thoughtful and thinking type of artist. And in the campus where he was attending, there were other students who were against the Shah, were against the king, were activists who believed in a new order that had to come to Iran, where there were civil liberties, freedom of expression, freedom of press, and so on and so forth. And despite the strides that Iran was making under the Pahlavi dynasty, civil liberties were still suffering. And in that way, Iran was kept back. And so these students, these intellectuals, were going to universities and were becoming very critical, especially on university campuses, of the things that Iran had yet to have, and they were rising against censorship. So my brother, in his first year of university, had found his way to these little underground opposition groups on the university campus, and my father had got wind of this and was afraid that this association between him and these activists on campus would get him into trouble with the police, with the security forces inside Iran. And he decided that the best thing, the safest thing for him to do was to send my brother away. And therefore, my brother's departure, in a way, becomes a window onto the realities of political life in Iran. And it's my first awakening about where we are as a country and where we are as a society and what's missing despite all the good things that I was experiencing. Now, fast forward this to 1978, which is only about 4 years later, and that brings us to the second passage that I'm about to read to you. By 1978, especially by December of 1978, my two younger brothers have followed in the footsteps of my brother Albert, and they had come to America. My parents and I were still in Iran, and I'm sure many of you know that 1978 was the year of revolution in Iran. What was happening in America? Thankfully for the movie Argo, many of you saw what was happening in Iran and subsequently what was happening in America. The President Carter was in power here in this country. We had a democratic administration here in this country, and there was some kind of a dance between the US administration and Iran in trying to figure out how much did we as Americans want to help push Iran towards the very thing that Iranians seemed to want at the time, which was openness, greater civil liberties, and political rights, and how much did we not want to stay away and wanted things to go on their own course, and I'm sure there are lots of other theories around this. But anyway, here we have President Carter, who has somewhat started becoming critical of the monarchy's treatment of political dissent in Iran. And inside Iran, there is a revolution in full splendor. Now, how does that revolution manifest itself? A lot of the images are now familiar to you by, having watched what happened on Tahrir Square in Egypt, Tunisia, and other places. The one that took place in Iran in 78 and 79 was a very nonviolent revolution that was, for the most part, being orchestrated by a religious dissident who was not in Iran, was in the suburbs of Paris in exile. And his name, the name of that religious figure was Ayatollah Khomeini. He, in 1978, he had been sent into exile about 15 years earlier. He was orchestrating and ordering many of these demonstrations and acts of protest that were taking place in Iran. One of the most brilliant acts of protest that he orchestrated all the way from exile in December of 1978 was something that really, really moved me, even as I was sitting in my pajamas in my basement in New Haven, Connecticut, writing this book years and years later. Because it was still effective and very haunting even so many years later. Now, what was it? Now imagine you're in a neighborhood, and perhaps the best basis of comparison for those of us in America was, you know, the first round of elections when candidate Obama was running. Many of the youth in this country got involved and got a sense of what political activism is about. And for me, it came in December of 1978 when this order had come from Paris, and somehow I, frequenting the homes of some neighbors nearby, understood to be sort of the big plan. And the big plan was for everyone in the neighborhood to turn off their lights at night at 9 p.m. exactly. So just picture this, that even if you were to do nothing else, that an entire neighborhood chooses to become completely dark at the same hour for the same duration is pretty dramatic. So the order was, at the strike of 9 o'clock, turn off every single light inside your homes. So the neighborhood becomes completely black. And go to your rooftops. Go to, you know, wherever the open air is. And of course, nobody sees you because there are no lights. So it's very safe when you're outside and it's completely dark and you show up on the rooftop. And for the duration of only 10 minutes, from 9 to 9:15 or 15 minutes, all of the neighbors, everybody in the same neighborhood, everybody throughout the country was invited to chant one thing. So it's pitch black. You all go out. And it isn't a democratic demonstration. You are all expected to repeat the very same thing. And that same chant was, God is great, or as the words were, Allahu Akbar. So in December of 1978, I hear that we're all expected to go to the rooftop and chant, God is great, per the orders that had come. And I was 12 years old and had to decide if I wanted to do it. And of course, being pre-adolescent and 12, it was very exciting. And so I go to the rooftop. So the passage I'm about to read to you is from that moment in December of '78. At 8:45 p.m., the lights in the homes began to go off one by one. By 8:55 p.m., not even the night was as dark as our neighborhood. All but the heavenly bodies had heeded the Ayatollah's message. Under the full moon, the antennas and the tin chimneys emanated a silvery glow, enhancing the majesty of the dark. Nothing hung from the clotheslines, not even pins. The neighbors were on the balconies and rooftops, even those with no intention to chant. And that was just what the Ayatollah did. He dazzled even his enemies by the power of his spectacles. Darkness had rendered all faces immaterial. The eye could only see the outlines of the crowd, some short, others tall, some hunched, a few seated. Those were the cynics waiting to see if the night would compel them to join. For the first time since I knew Z was a girlfriend I had in the neighborhood. Her family had come together in one place. Great uncle next to Mrs. Banu, who stood beside her husband, each holding one of the twins. Z's brothers tossed the rock in their hands. Bibi rested an arm on Z's shoulder. This was the Ayatollah's first miracle, a family united. And my family. I hopped over the dividers between the rooftops and joined my parents. Father was repeating under his breath, "Helen, do you see this? For as long as the eye can see, one stinking mullah can do all this?" To commit what was memorable to mind, Father always needed Mother as a witness. "Shh," she elbowed him. Father teased her. "Try to say Allahu Akbar, Helen, or we would risk irking the goyim." Could I say Allahu Akbar? The words echoed in my mind, but I could not utter them. "Say it," I urged myself. 1, 2, 3. But I could not. I had never had to say words in Arabic, to chant in a language other than my native Persian. I had never been expected to sound like a Muslim. Must I choose? My heart was fluttering in my chest and everywhere else. Excitement pulsated in my ears, it throbbed in my belly. I feared something unknown. I was brimming with the thrill of something unknown. My parents were scared, whereas no one around us seemed to be. Z signaled me from the distance, inviting me to join her family, and I found myself torn between staying on our rooftop or going to hers. Suddenly, I envied Z, who was standing among her siblings. I envied their togetherness, their certainty, their eager anticipation for 9 o'clock to strike. At 8:57 p.m., 2 rocks struck the bulbs of the light poles at each end of the alley. The skitter of the shards against the asphalt in an alley so hushed sounded as if 1,000 glass bottles had shattered. No one said a word. At 8:58, the alley of the distinguished stretched like a common alley, dark and desolate. But at 9, it came to life. Moans of Allahu Akbar billowed through the night. They were not orchestrated sounds, but fitful, scattered through the alley. They rose as if every person's throat had been clutched. Their chests heaved with each breath, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. Each Allah expanded in the windpipes, inhaling air as if it were rapidly running out. For every gasp, 100 more echoed in sympathy. The Allahs drawled longer with each chant, H's barely fading under the Akbars, until all fizzled into a single Allah. Greatness slowly sundering, then dissipating in the intoxicated throats. The cloud of a single plea plumed over the alley. By 9:08, the plea was a desperation reverberating in his name, Allah and not another word. Allah, and it sealed all the untold. Every home a heap of kindling, the alley was a bonfire. Phantom flames had scorched the neighborhood. A thick, sonorous smoke hovered over every home. Every man, every woman, every child was burning. Everyone a victim, everyone an arsonist. So December of 1978 is followed by January, and in January of 1979, the King of Iran, Shah, leaves the country on what he had hoped to just be a short vacation, but then he never returns. By middle of February, everything you saw in the movie Argo becomes true. The revolutionaries succeed. They overthrow not just the regime that was in power, not just the king, but also 2,500 years of monarchy in Iran falls away. And so a new era, the only theocracy that we have come to know, begins. Now, it's very important for us here because it's the place in the world where hostility towards the United States gets to be staged. It's no longer a small act against America, but something full-blown staged on the streets of Iran and manifested in the takeover of the American embassy, which changes forever the relationship between Iran and the US, which had always been friendly, transforms the US embassy in Tehran, which was the greatest, largest compound of the United States anywhere in the Middle East, to basically an abandoned building, which it remains till today. When do I stop? This is a good time? Oh. Would ask some questions. So the embassy is taken over. Later on, in about 4 years, my family, my mother and I leave Iran. That's a whole other ordeal. But what also begins, which is very significant, is an awful war between Iran and Iraq, and then the stalemate between Iran and the US, which has lasted till today. The book, the memoir, ends in 1984, which is the year my mom and I leave, and my father joins us about 4 years later in New York, which is where we ended up originally. Thank you so much for your time, and thank you for being here.